Cold winds scraped across the barbed wire fences of northern Germany. April 15, 1945. Bergen-Belsen, British tanks rolled to a halt before a camp that smelled not of gunpowder, but of death. Behind the rusted gates, 60,000 prisoners lay in filth and silence. Men, women, and children reduced to bone. Typhus, dysentery, starvation. Invisible enemies that had already killed tens of thousands. Among the first British units were medics and engineers, not soldiers of conquest, but soldiers of sanitation. Their mission: save who could be saved, and stop the plague from escaping the wire. Within hours, new orders swept the camp. Every person, soldier, prisoner, guard, must be deloused, disinfected, stripped of infected rags. But when the same order reached a group of captured German women, former guards and nurses, they refused. Standing under the cold spray of carbolic mist, one voice snapped back in defiance, "We won't take our clothes off." What followed was not punishment, but a battle against disease, denial, and history itself. The camp at Bergen-Belsen was never built for the horrors it came to hold. In 1940, on the heathered plains of Lower Saxony, it began as a POW camp, Stalag 1C, meant for French and Belgian prisoners. Later, the Wehrmacht expanded it to hold Soviet captives. Thousands of those early prisoners were starved, frozen, and buried in shallow pits before the SS even arrived. By 1943, control shifted to Heinrich Himmler's SS, transforming Belsen into what was cynically called an exchange camp, a place where select Jews were to be traded for German civilians abroad. The name sounded administrative. The reality became unspeakable. Throughout 1944, as the Reich collapsed, train after train rolled in from Auschwitz, Dachau, and Ravensbrück. They carried the unfit, the dying, the ones left behind by the Nazi machine. But the trains didn't return. They stopped at Belsen, a limbo of lice, typhus, and rot. Inside the barbed wire compound, food ran out first, then water, then space. Barracks meant for 3,000 held 10,000. Bodies were stacked in bunks. Latrines overflowed into the paths. The air was heavy with decay, the soil itself black with contamination. By early April 1945, over 60,000 inmates were still trapped within its perimeters. The SS commandant, Josef Kramer, requested negotiations to surrender the camp intact, claiming he wanted to avoid a typhus outbreak reaching the front. British command agreed. For once, the guns would stay silent. At dawn on April 15th, tanks of the 11th Armored Division approached the wire. What they saw that morning would scar military history forever. Corporal Ian Forsyth, one of the first men inside, later said, "It wasn't war. It was something beyond that." Men who'd crossed Normandy and the Rhine stood motionless before the mounds of corpses. The noise of flies drowned their voices. The stench clawed through respirators. The living crawled between the dead, begging for water. Some drank from puddles thick with ash. Others simply stared, eyes too empty for recognition. British commanders quickly realized this was not a liberation, but a medical emergency on a scale unseen in modern warfare. General Brian Horrocks ordered an immediate quarantine. Engineers cordoned off the area with barbed wire. A single phrase echoed through field radios and officer briefings: "No one leaves Belsen alive or dead until the epidemic is contained." Over the next 48 hours, Royal Army Medical Corps, RAMC officers, nurses from the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service, and Red Cross volunteers began an impossible operation. They faced starvation, disease, and psychological collapse, all in one place. Water trucks arrived. Mobile kitchens followed. Then the disinfectant lorries. Yet even before the relief could start, another threat grew. Invisible, airborne, lethal. Typhus, spread by lice, killing hundreds daily. Inside the British command tents, the order went out. All persons, including German guards and civilians, will undergo delousing procedures. That meant full disinfection, head to toe, clothes burned, bodies scrubbed, hair shorn if necessary. But the SS guards, especially the women, balked. They claimed modesty, humiliation, or military rank. To British medics, those excuses meant nothing. Hygiene wasn't symbolic. It was survival. Every delay meant another death. Nearby, bulldozers were brought in, not for construction, but to bury over 10,000 corpses lying in open air. Flames from the pyres mixed with the fumes of carbolic acid. By April 18th, the British had set up triage zones. Zone 1, those who might survive. Zone 2, those critical but treatable. Zone 3, the dying. No man or woman entered the camp without delousing. No food was distributed without sterilization. No sympathy could override quarantine protocol. For the first time in the war, the victors found themselves waging battle not against soldiers, but against disease, disorder, and disbelief. And as they fought to reclaim life from death, one confrontation in particular, a defiant cry from a captured guard, would become symbolic of the psychological collision between occupier and liberator. It began with a sentence, "We won't take our clothes off." That resistance, and the moral line it exposed, would define the next stage of the story, when sanitation became strategy, and medicine became justice. In the days after liberation, Belsen became something unprecedented. Not a victory post, not a camp, but a sprawling epidemic zone under military occupation. The British 11th Armoured Division had conquered many objectives, but never one like this. Their rifles were of little use. Their enemies were invisible: lice, typhus, dysentery, and despair. The operation to contain the camp was directed by the Royal Army Medical Corps, RAMC, supported by the Royal Engineers, the Pioneer Corps, and civilian volunteers. At its head stood Brigadier Glyn Hughes, Deputy Director of Medical Services, a man trained to heal battlefield wounds, not to manage death on an industrial scale. Yet he would become the architect of the Belsen Relief Plan. The first priority was quarantine. British patrols set up barbed wire perimeters several miles out, sealing off every road. Nothing, no cart, no refugee, not even a dog, was allowed to pass without clearance. Inside, the RAMC established medical zones and assigned numbers to each hut. Every step was documented, photographed, and logged. The British knew what they had discovered had to stand as evidence. Next came sanitation. Within 48 hours, portable delousing units arrived. Engineers set up what they grimly called the human laundry. It was a converted German army barrack where survivors and captured guards alike were stripped, shaved, scrubbed in disinfectant, and issued clean blankets. Their old clothing, crawling with lice, was incinerated in metal drums behind the building. To the British, this was standard epidemic control. To the Germans, especially the captured female guards and nurses, it was humiliation. Eyewitness reports describe groups of SS women standing rigid, refusing to undress, clutching their uniforms as if dignity could replace soap. One British medical orderly recorded in his diary, "They cried that they were soldiers. We told them that disease respects no rank." For the first time, the roles had reversed. The very people who had once overseen the degradation of prisoners were now ordered to submit to the same procedure. Their defiance, "We won't take our clothes off," echoed not from pride, but shock. They had entered a world where German authority meant nothing. Brigadier Hughes made the policy clear. No exception. Hygiene is discipline. Discipline is survival. And so the guards, under escort, were processed through the delousing line alongside the prisoners. Lice-ridden clothing was burned in piles. Carbolic spray hissed through the air, the smell of disinfectant mixed with death. While this unfolded, British officers coordinated with relief agencies. The International Red Cross arrived with medical rations and vaccines. The Friends Relief Service, a Quaker humanitarian group, brought teams to assist nurses. The UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, prepared for what came next: feeding, reclothing, and repatriating tens of thousands of displaced persons. Meanwhile, British field hospitals were improvised in nearby army huts and schools. Over 13,000 survivors were transferred in the first week. Many carried on stretchers so frail they seemed weightless. But the battle was not just against typhus. It was against contamination of conscience. Every soldier who entered Belsen was ordered through delousing, no matter his rank or status. The British understood that if the disease spread beyond those fences, it could devastate entire units across Germany. The epidemic became the equalizer. Nazi nurses, SS guards, British privates, Jewish survivors, all were reduced to the same medical category: potential carrier. And yet, in that reduction lay a grim moral clarity. The war had been fought to prove that human life mattered. Now at Belsen, that principle was being tested in its purest form. Not by words, but by soap, spray, and order. For days the process continued. Thousands disinfected, thousands buried. Each night, the camp's fires burned low, and British engineers pushed bulldozers through mass graves to stop the next day's contagion. The photographs from those nights, taken under arc lamps and moonlight, became historical evidence used at the Belsen trials later that year. When questioned, one of the captured guards, Irma Greta, was asked if she had refused orders during the delousing. She denied it, but the witness statements told another story. The resistance had been brief, the disease merciless. By the end of April, the delousing stations had processed over 30,000 individuals. Typhus cases began to decline. The smell of carbolic hung in the air for weeks, the scent of British medicine fighting to reclaim the boundaries of civilization. And yet, this was only the beginning. Because what the medics achieved in procedure, the world would soon need to understand in perspective. From the sanitary trenches of Belsen emerged not just relief, but evidence, testimony, and the first drafts of post-war justice. The human angle. Between liberation and shock when the British soldiers entered Belsen, they expected surrender. What they found was silence. A silence so absolute it unnerved even battle-hardened men. The survivors didn't cheer. They didn't run to the gates. They simply stared. Most were too weak to stand, too numb to react. Liberation had come, but it came too late for tens of thousands. British troops, trained to fight tanks and artillery, now faced a human battlefield. One of skeletal faces, open sores, and eyes that no longer recognized life. They offered biscuits, chocolate, and cigarettes, small tokens of humanity. But the results were tragic. Many survivors, long starved, ate too quickly and died from shock or intestinal rupture. Captain Richard Dimbleby, the BBC correspondent who entered days later, described it as a place where every sense was assaulted. His voice cracked on air. London listeners heard, perhaps for the first time, what industrial cruelty sounded like when the machine stopped. For the British Guards, the line between duty and compassion blurred. They fed the living while bulldozing the dead. Some broke down. Others forced themselves numb, focusing only on procedure. The human laundry, the disinfectant tents, the feeding lines, all became rituals in a grim resurrection. In this chaos, even German captives, once enforcers, now looked terrified, stripped not just of authority, but identity. Their refusal to undress, their cries of "We are soldiers," were not rebellion, but denial. They could not yet grasp that uniforms no longer mattered in a place where disease outranked ideology. For the survivors, those same orders to delouse and disinfect were the first true acts of mercy they had seen in years. The same process that humiliated the guards, saved the victims. For the first time, the cleansing wasn't punishment, it was protection. And as each survivor emerged from the spray, wrapped in British Army blankets, there was a small restoration, not of nation, not of politics, but of personhood. The medical angle, a war within a war. The Royal Army Medical Corps had never seen anything like Belsen. Its officers were combat surgeons, not epidemic specialists. Yet within hours, they turned the camp into a quarantine hospital. The principal killer was typhus, caused by Rickettsia prowazekii, carried by lice. Each louse bite injected fever, delirium, and death. There were no antibiotics, only sulfa drugs, DDT powder, carbolic acid, and isolation. Field hospitals were set up in nearby barracks. Nurses worked around the clock, administering fluids and attempting to stabilize body temperatures. Patients often died mid-treatment. Every surface, bed, and blanket was sprayed. Every nurse was deloused before and after shifts. Every instrument was boiled until the metal tarnished. By late April, the British imported DDT sprayers, new American-made devices. The white dust coated the patient's skin like chalk, choking the lice instantly. Within days, infection rates slowed, but the medical effort went beyond biology. It was psychological. Doctors had to teach the survivors how to eat again, starting with liquid rations, spoon-fed, every few hours. The feeding schedule was stricter than military protocol. Too much food could kill. Too little prolonged agony. The nurses, many barely older than their patients, wrote that the smell of death never left their clothes. Some burned their uniforms after leaving. One recalled, "We scrubbed our hands until they bled, but we could still smell it." Every medical decision was an act of triage. Who could live, who could not? In that sense, Belsen became a moral hospital. The doctors weren't just fighting disease. They were trying to salvage meaning. And yet, in their notes and diaries, there is no self-congratulation, only exhaustion. "We saved some," wrote one lieutenant, "but we learned what hell looks like when you try to disinfect it." The tactical angle. Logistics of survival. While medics fought microscopic enemies, the Royal Engineers waged a logistical war. The camp had no functioning water supply. The wells were contaminated, the pipes corroded. Engineers dug new boreholes under armed guard, their every move watched by the emaciated crowd beyond the wire. They built disinfectant baths, drainage ditches, and makeshift cremation pits. They diverted army trucks, normally used for ammunition, to transport food, blankets, and medical gear. Order had to be restored, not by force, but by coordination. Every corpse was tagged and moved in rotation. Every hut was numbered, mapped, and recorded in official reports. British officers documented everything for one purpose: evidence. At night, generator lamps glared across the camp. Bulldozers rumbled in the dark, their steel tracks crushing earth over mass graves. Engineers worked in respirators, sweating under rubberized suits. Some vomited from the stench. Others kept working in silence. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were custodians of the aftermath. Men fighting chaos with clipboards and cables. One captain later described Belsen as a front line with no enemy and no victory. He was wrong. There was an enemy. Disease, disorder, and the collapse of human order itself. And victory, though unseen, came in increments. A clean blanket here, a disinfected hut there, a child still breathing by morning. By the end of the first week, the camp had been transformed from a charnel house into a controlled emergency zone. The smell still lingered, the corpses still burned, but the structure of order had returned. Yet beyond the procedures lay deeper questions, moral ones. What did it mean to force a former oppressor to obey orders for life, not death? Where was the line between punishment and purification? Those questions would define the next dimension of the story. The moral and evidentiary angles, where the meaning of cleansing would shift from hygiene to justice. The moral angle, cleansing, authority and accountability. At Belsen, moral gravity reversed overnight. For years, German guards had controlled life and death with a gesture. Now, they stood under orders themselves. Unarmed, ununiformed, and powerless. When British medical officers commanded the delousing of all personnel, it wasn't vengeance. It was necessity. Yet the moment carried deep moral resonance. The act of stripping away uniforms and disinfecting bodies blurred the line between punishment and purification. To the guards, it was humiliation. The loss of status, gendered privacy, and authority. To the British, it was medicine, hygiene as the new law. To the survivors, it was poetic justice. The same captors who had forced prisoners into showers were now being washed under guard. But this reversal wasn't about revenge. The British command, aware of propaganda risks, forbade any abuse. Orders were clear. They will be treated humanely, but without privilege. That principle, restraint under revulsion, became a moral marker of Allied conduct. This was civilization reasserting itself not with anger, but with control. Amid the chaos, discipline itself became the moral frontier. And in that cold, disinfectant-soaked barrack, the hierarchy of war, victor and vanquished, dissolved into a single fact. Every human body could carry disease, and no ideology could shield it. The legal angle, from quarantine to courtroom, every record, every photograph, every medical report from Belsen was preserved with a specific purpose: evidence. The British officers knew that what they had uncovered was not merely horror, it was proof. Over the following months, these documents became the backbone of the Belsen trials, held at Lüneburg in the autumn of 1945. The accused included Josef Kramer, the camp commandant, and Irma Greta, the young female SS guard infamous for her cruelty. But in the courtroom, something new emerged. The British prosecutors didn't only show chains of command, they showed systems of neglect, typhus outbreaks, starvation, sanitation failure. All were presented as consequences of administrative choice, not wartime chaos. When footage from the camp was shown in court, even seasoned legal officers turned away. The prosecution's argument was precise. These deaths were not acts of God. They were acts of policy. Medical officers who had overseen delousing and burial testified to the condition of the corpses. Engineers described the logistics of disposal. Every file, every film reel, every body counted, literally and legally. What began as a quarantine operation became a case study in modern war crimes law. For the first time, hygiene reports and medical logs were entered as evidence of murder. And at the heart of it stood the question, when does neglect become a weapon? The answer, written in witness statements and trial transcripts, would shape the next half-century of humanitarian law. The evidentiary angle, cameras, paintings, and proof from the first day. British commanders ordered comprehensive documentation. Combat cameramen from the Army Film and Photographic Unit, led by Sergeant Mike Lewis and Sergeant Harry Oakes, recorded every stage of the relief. Their film, later edited into Belsen concentration camp, 1945, remains one of the most harrowing records of the war. The footage showed more than corpses. It showed systems, water trucks, disinfectant lines, nurses at work. It proved that the Allies had responded not with retribution, but with order. Alongside the cameras came the war artists. Dame Laura Knight and Doris Zinkeisen sketched the human laundry, rendering medics in gloves and masks, SS guards scrubbing under spray, and survivors being deloused with gentleness the Nazis had denied them. Zinkeisen titled one painting simply, Belsen, the Cleaners. It was both literal and symbolic. For decades after, these images shaped collective understanding. The delousing tents became a visual shorthand for the restoration of humanity through hygiene, the battle to reclaim dignity from decay. The British didn't censor what they found, they exhibited it. Newsreels were screened in cinemas across Britain, often preceded by a warning. These scenes are not pleasant, but they are the truth. Audiences sat in stunned silence. Some walked out, others wept. This deliberate transparency was itself a weapon, not of propaganda, but of proof. In a war built on lies, the British response was documentation. And in doing so, they ensured that the sentence, "We won't take our clothes off," would never again be heard as protest, but as the echo of a vanishing regime's pride. By May 1945, Belsen was both a medical outpost and a moral crucible, a place where human decency was redefined not by ideology, but by behavior. The delousing lines became symbols of transition, from war to peace, from denial to evidence, from survival to justice. Yet for all the disinfectant and order, the disease of memory lingered. What happened in those barracks would haunt Britain's medics, artists, and officers for years, and it would also prepare them, unknowingly, for the next great turning point. The systematic transformation of Belsen from a camp of death into a hospital of life. By the third week of April 1945, Belsen had become a battlefield without weapons. The front line ran not between nations but between life and decay. British medics, engineers, and officers, barely rested from weeks of advance, now fought a new war, one against infection, exhaustion, and disbelief. The turning point came on April 20th, the same day Hitler celebrated his final birthday in a collapsing Berlin. In the ruins of the Reich's capital, delusion ruled. At Belsen, discipline did. Brigadier Glyn Hughes, now de facto governor of the camp, declared martial medical law. He issued the order that defined the operation. Every living person shall be deloused, clothed, fed, and recorded. Every dead body shall be buried or burned before nightfall. Hygiene is the only commandment. It was a sentence as clinical as it was absolute. The enforcement British troops began the systematic cleansing of the camp. Delousing lines ran day and night. Survivors were carried to the human laundry. Limp bodies lifted onto stretchers, washed, powdered with DDT, and wrapped in blankets. Each was tagged with a number, their identity slowly returning through paperwork and care. Meanwhile, groups of captured SS men and women, about 80 in total, were marched into work details. Under armed supervision, they shoveled corpses, disinfected huts, and dragged wagon loads of bodies to the burial trenches. At first, some resisted. There were shouts, tears, refusals, but the British were unyielding. They made it clear, "You will clean what you created. No beatings, no revenge, only duty." Guards who collapsed were replaced. Those who refused were placed under arrest and disinfected by force. The moral inversion was complete. Once guilty hands were now forced to cleanse the evidence of their own crimes. The most famous photograph from this phase, an SS woman standing amid rows of corpses, shovel in hand, guarded by British soldiers, captured that reversal. It became the visual proof that justice had begun long before the courtroom. The struggle to save. While punishment unfolded outside, inside the hospital tents, nurses fought hour by hour for the living. The newly arrived Queen Alexandra's nurses, women in khaki uniforms and surgical masks, faced rows of skeletal patients. They washed them, dressed their wounds, whispered in languages they didn't share. Some survivors clung to their hands in fear that the nurses might vanish like the rest of the world had. Each life saved required food, rest, and endless patience. To prevent fatal refeeding, doctors introduced a strict regimen called the Belsen diet. Thin gruel, glucose water, and vitamin injections. It went against every instinct to feed the starving. But science had to override emotion. Still, many died during the night. The nurses learned not to look at faces too long. Attachment was a luxury they couldn't afford. Among the medical staff was Captain Derek Sington, a British interpreter. He later recalled watching the SS guards being deloused. There was no hatred, only exhaustion. We were beyond that. We were simply trying to stop the smell of death from spreading any further. Every disinfected uniform burned. Every shaved head, every scrubbed floor. All of it was a tactical operation against an invisible foe. By April 23rd, the infection rate began to slow. The daily death toll, once over 500, dropped below 200. The war in Europe was still raging. But here, within the barbed wire of Belsen, a microcosm of victory was taking form. Order conquering chaos. The moment of realization. One evening, as the sun dipped below the pine forest, Brigadier Hughes walked through the camp perimeter. The air still carried smoke from the burial pits. Nurses worked under flickering lanterns. In the distance, the hum of generators mingled with prayer. Survivors thanking no one and everyone at once. He later wrote, "I saw civilization measured in soap and discipline." That was the essence of Belsen's turning point. Not a battle won by gunfire, but by procedure. British soldiers had been trained to storm fortresses. Here they learned to rebuild humanity, one disinfected hand at a time. Yet the true test of endurance was only beginning. Because once the living were cleaned, clothed, and fed, the question of what to do with them remained. Tens of thousands of displaced people. No homes, no documents, no nation, and all of it under British control. The first stage of salvation had ended. The second, rebuilding life from ashes, was about to begin. By late April 1945, the worst at Belsen was beginning to stabilize, but only just. The smell of carbolic acid now mingled with smoke from the burial pits. The sound of gunfire had faded, replaced by the mechanical groan of bulldozers, the hum of generators, and the monotonous hiss of DDT sprayers. The first and fiercest battle, against typhus, was being won. The second, against hunger and chaos, had only begun. The mechanics of the dead, for days after liberation, the dead outnumbered the living. More than 10,000 bodies lay unburied in and around the camp. Many had been left where they fell, on paths, in bunks, beside water troughs. The British had to act quickly before decomposition turned Belsen into a biological bomb. Under the supervision of the Royal Engineers, German prisoners, including SS guards, Wehrmacht troops, and nearby civilians, were ordered to clear the corpses. They wore armbands that read simply, Volkspflicht, duty of the people. Each morning, trucks ferried them to the camp under guard. They carried corpses by the limbs, loaded them onto wagons, and dumped them into massive trenches dug by bulldozers. The work was silent. No one spoke. British soldiers stood watch, rifles ready, but unused. There was no ceremony. Only order. Every trench was mapped, every number logged. The British were building not only sanitation, but history. A record of death, precise and undeniable. Captain John Moore, Royal Engineers, wrote in his diary, "We are cleaning hell, one shovel at a time." By May 1st, the last visible bodies were buried. The camp's surface was finally cleared, though the earth itself remained poisoned with disease. Controlled feeding, the science of survival. Feeding the survivors proved as perilous as fighting the epidemic. Starvation had reduced many to skeletal frames. Their organs, especially their stomachs, could not process normal food. Medical staff learned quickly that compassion could kill. Brigadier Hughes established a scientific feeding program. The first stage was the glucose phase. Sugar water, fed slowly with spoons or droppers. Then came the protein milk mix, developed by British dietitians and tested on a few patients before mass use. When solid food was finally introduced, it was in crumbs, not portions. Nurses rationed every bite. Soldiers delivered food under watch to prevent mobbing. It was an eerie inversion. Discipline enforced not by fear, but by necessity. Some survivors resisted the rules. They wanted to eat freely, as if hunger could be erased in a single meal. Many died trying. The doctors learned to feed them by patience, not pity. Each hut received a feeding chart, with intake schedules and caloric limits. British diet officers called it Operation Sustenance. Within 2 weeks, the death toll dropped again. By mid-May, the survivors' faces began to change. No longer gray, but faintly alive. Photographs from this phase show a haunting contrast. The same women who once refused to undress for delousing now handing food to the prisoners they once commanded, under British orders. It was not redemption but restitution. Rebuilding the living as infection ebbed, the camp evolved. The British transformed a nearby Wehrmacht barracks into the Belsen Displaced Persons Hospital. Here survivors received real beds, medical supervision, and food prepared under sterile conditions. For the first time in months, the weak lay in clean sheets. Psychological rehabilitation began, though the word didn't yet exist in military vocabulary. Chaplains and interpreters helped reconnect survivors with humanity, offering writing paper, family tracing, even music. In one tent, a small choir formed, survivors singing in Yiddish, Polish, and Hebrew. British soldiers paused outside, listening in silence. The songs had no triumph in them, only endurance. Meanwhile, the SS prisoners, deloused, disciplined, and documented, were transferred to holding camps for interrogation. Several would soon face trial in Lüneburg, charged with crimes against humanity. Their images, once symbols of terror, now stood as exhibits in the case for truth. The quiet. After the storm, by June 1945, Belsen had changed beyond recognition. Where death had been piled in mounds, now stood disinfectant tanks, laundry stations, and medical tents. Children were seen playing with British soldiers' helmets. Nurses laughed again, though quietly. A British report dated June 30, 1945, summarized the transformation in one line. The camp is no longer a menace to health, though its memory remains a wound. The bulldozers that had buried the dead now flattened ground for vegetable gardens. Typhus had been eradicated. Hunger was under control, and yet, for those who had walked through those gates in April, the stench, the sights and the sounds of that place never left them. Lieutenant Colonel Mervyn Gonin, one of the officers who helped stabilize the camp, later wrote, "It was not courage that saved Belsen. It was discipline. The discipline to wash hands, to follow orders, to feed slowly, to record everything. That was civilization fighting for its life." By the summer, Belsen stood not just as a medical victory, but as a monument to procedure, proof that order could reclaim even the darkest corners of war. But order was not closure. The survivors still had no homes. The guards awaited judgment, and the British soldiers who had seen too much carried invisible scars home with them. As Belsen transformed from camp to hospital, another transformation began. From immediate relief to long-term reckoning. The aftermath would reveal what the world did with what the British had found, what justice meant in ruins, and how the memory of Belsen changed the conscience of nations. When the last bulldozer shut down and the camp gates finally stood open, Bergen-Belsen no longer resembled a prison. It was a crime scene. The British had cleaned it, sanitized it, and photographed it, but they had not erased what had happened there. And that was intentional. The 11th Armored Division left behind not just a liberated camp, but a mountain of documentation. Witness statements, burial counts, medical charts, and thousands of photographs. Every image, every report would become the raw material for one of the most significant war crimes trials in history. The Belsen trial, held in the German town of Lüneburg between September and November 1945, 22 men and 18 women stood accused. Among them were Josef Kramer, the camp commandant, Franz Hössler, a former Auschwitz official, and female SS guards such as Irma Greta, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann. Their crimes were not tied to ideology alone. They were tied to actions and neglect. The prosecution's case was built not only on testimonies of brutality, but on medical evidence collected by the British Army. The delousing records, the typhus logs, the feeding schedules, all became courtroom exhibits, showing that the conditions were not the result of wartime chaos, but of deliberate inhumanity. When film from Belsen was screened during the trial, silence fell in the chamber. The camera panned across the human laundry, the burial pits, and the corpses still lying in the sun. The footage didn't need commentary. The judges, officers, and even the accused stared at the images as if seeing them for the first time. In their verdict, the British military court made a distinction that would define all future humanitarian law. To be responsible for conditions that make life impossible is no different from killing. Josef Kramer and Irma Greta were sentenced to death and executed that December. Others received long prison terms. But the trial wasn't about revenge. It was about legal precedent. For the first time, systemic neglect and administrative cruelty were judged as war crimes equal to active murder. The numbers, by the time the British finally closed the emergency hospitals at Belsen in June 1945, the toll was staggering: $3,000. Corpses were buried in the first 10 days after liberation. An additional 14,000 prisoners died in the weeks that followed despite medical care, out of roughly 60,000 liberated. Fewer than 30,000 ultimately survived to be repatriated. The British military also lost men to typhus, At least 17 medical personnel and soldiers succumbed while serving in the camp. Their graves, too, were marked with the same phrase: "They died that others might live." Statistics alone could not measure what had occurred, but the numbers gave shape to something that words struggled to contain. The sheer scale of suffering in a place that had never been a death camp by design, but had become one by collapse. The British War Office report concluded bluntly, Belsen was the ultimate consequence of a system that valued obedience over life. The Reckoning. The Belsen trials became a model for later prosecutions, including Nuremberg. British prosecutors pioneered the legal definition of command responsibility, that an officer could be guilty not only for what he ordered, but for what he failed to prevent. This principle would echo across decades in tribunals from Yugoslavia to Rwanda, all tracing back to that spring in 1945, when doctors and engineers documented not just the dead, but the reasons they had died. Public reaction in Britain was one of disbelief and anger. Newspapers printed photographs of the camp with captions that read, "These are the people we fought." Churches held special services of mourning. Parliament debated the moral meaning of the word liberation, and yet among those who had served at Belsen, the sentiment was quieter. Many spoke not of justice, but of contamination, of the way the camp had seeped into their minds. They returned home to quiet towns and clean uniforms, but the smell of carbolic and decay stayed with them. One nurse wrote, "We learned that civilization is not built on victory, but on hygiene, patience, and decency, or it dies." By late 1945, Bergen-Belsen stood empty. The barracks had been burned to prevent further infection. Only the mass graves remained, marked with wooden signs. "Here lie 10,000 dead. May humanity never forget." But memory, unlike disease, cannot be disinfected. And in the years that followed, Belsen became more than a place. It became a mirror for the world's conscience. When the last hospital tents were dismantled in the summer of 1945, the war was over, but Belsen's story was not. The site that had witnessed such degradation was about to begin a quieter, longer struggle, not of armies, but of memory, rebuilding, and moral repair. The displaced persons as the medical crisis subsided. Belsen was repurposed once again, this time by the British Control Commission and UNRWA, who transformed the nearby Wehrmacht barracks into the Bergen-Belsen displaced persons camp. It became one of Europe's largest refugee centers. Between 1945 and 1950, more than 12,000 survivors passed through its gates, Jews from Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and other shattered nations. Here, for the first time in years, they were not inmates or patients. They were citizens of nowhere, trying to remember what belonging felt like. Under British supervision, they organized schools, cultural clubs, and political councils. Rabbis held services. Marriages were celebrated. Children were born. Out of a place of death, life quite literally restarted. One photograph from 1946 shows a wedding in the camp's synagogue, the bride wearing a gown made from a British Army parachute. Behind her, the groom, a former prisoner, stands beneath a Star of David carved from scrap wood. The caption reads, "First wedding in Belsen DP camp." For many survivors, Belsen became the first stepping stone to a new life, in Palestine, America, or the emerging state of Israel. They carried their scars and their stories with them, ensuring that what had happened would not vanish in silence. But for the British soldiers who had run the camp, Belsen remained a permanent scar, a reminder that victory could coexist with horror, and that liberation was not always salvation. The legacy in medicine and law. The lessons of Belsen reshaped post-war medicine and public health policy. The British Army's experience there became a case study in epidemic control, a model for the newly founded World Health Organization in 1948. Techniques refined in Belsen, mass delousing, controlled feeding, quarantine zoning, were codified into military and civilian manuals across the world. But perhaps the greater legacy lay in law and ethics. Belsen's documentation was among the first systematic collections of human rights evidence in modern history. It taught the Allies that crimes of neglect and disease could be as deliberate and as prosecutable as crimes of execution. At the Nuremberg trials, medical officers from Belsen provided expert testimony about starvation, typhus, and forced labor. Their data shaped international conventions on the treatment of prisoners and civilians. Decades later, humanitarian organizations like Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, would trace their principles of neutrality and medical impartiality back to the precedent set by the Royal Army Medical Corps at Belsen. Doctors treating all, even enemies, because disease recognized no uniform. The memory and the place. The physical site of Bergen-Belsen was demolished in 1950. The British burned the barracks to the ground, leaving only the earth, marked, fenced, and silent. A memorial stone was erected, inscribed in Hebrew, English, and German. Earth conceal not the blood shed on thee. Over the decades, survivors returned to plant trees and lay flowers. Their children came too, sometimes standing in quiet disbelief that so much horror could vanish into forest and meadow. Today, the Bergen-Belsen Memorial, run by the German state of Lower Saxony, stands as both museum and warning. Its exhibits include the British film reels, the nurses' diaries, and the preserved delousing equipment, reminders of the day when civilization returned to Belsen not with vengeance, but with soap, order, and restraint. For German students, visiting the site is mandatory. For Jewish families, it is pilgrimage. For British veterans, it remains a memory both proud and unbearable. The human echo in a BBC interview decades later, Sergeant Mike Lewis, one of the Army photographers who filmed the liberation, was asked what he remembered most vividly. He didn't mention the corpses or the SS guards. He said, "It was the smell of disinfectant, because it meant someone was still trying to save something. That smell, of carbolic and clean water, became the scent of moral recovery. It was the quiet symbol of how humanity reasserted itself after descending to its lowest point." From that spring of 1945 onward, Belsen ceased to be a geographical name. It became a word that defined what happens when structure collapses, when conscience sleeps, and when civilization has to rebuild itself molecule by molecule. And it also became proof that even in the ashes of order, order can return. But one question still lingers, unanswered and eternal. How close did the world come to forgetting that line between procedure and compassion? And what happens when it's crossed again? The answers lie not in the courts or the graves, but in reflection, in the part of history that refuses to die quietly. There are moments in history when victory feels hollow, when the guns fall silent, yet the world seems darker for what it has seen. Bergen-Belsen was one of those moments. It was not a battlefield, not a city liberated, not a triumph of flags. It was a confrontation with what humanity had allowed itself to become. For the British soldiers who entered those gates in April 1945, the war changed meaning. They had not come to conquer, but to cleanse. In the decades that followed, they would rarely speak of it. When they did, their words carried the stillness of trauma. They didn't remember battles or medals. They remembered the smell of disinfectant and decay, life and death intertwined. They remembered the faces of the survivors and the silence of those they could not save. And yet out of that silence, something enduring emerged. A proof that civilization can be rebuilt, not with speeches or revenge, but with discipline, order, and decency. The medics, nurses, and engineers of Belsen fought a war no one trained them for, a war against indifference. Their weapons were soap, clipboards, and compassion. Their victory was measured not in ground gained, but in lives reclaimed. In the records they left behind, the film reels, the diaries, the reports. History found its conscience again. For every image of horror there was another of effort. Hands washing, blankets covering, nurses tending. It was proof that even in the ruins, human beings could still choose to heal. Belsen became a warning, yes, but also a testament, that when civilization collapses, it can still be rebuilt by those who refuse to look away. And in that act of refusal lies the quietest, most powerful form of courage. Today, the ground where Belsen stood is peaceful. Pine trees sway where barbed wire once hummed. The air carries no stench, only birdsong. But beneath that calm earth lie thousands. Victims, witnesses, and, in a sense, teachers. Their lesson is simple, eternal, and carved into the memorial stone. May humanity never forget. Because memory, like hygiene, must be maintained, or history itself begins to decay. If you made it this far, you've walked through one of the darkest and most defining moments of the 20th century. Not as a spectator, but as a witness. Don't let Bergen-Belsen fade into statistics or silence. Share this story. Revisit the records. Tell someone what the human laundry really meant. That even in hell, human beings chose to clean, to heal, to care. Honor the medics, the nurses, the survivors. They showed that civilization is not measured by strength, but by how we respond to suffering. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold histories of WWII, battles, technologies, and the human stories behind them. Comment your thoughts. What lesson from Belsen still matters most today? And above all, remember, because history doesn't stay alive by being remembered once, it survives by being retold.